consulting company, and I use population statistics to inform decision making nearly every day of the week in my work, and many of my clients are from governments of all levels. So I am very, very excited to be chairing today's session. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are zooming in from all across, from different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island countries and lands. I'm talking to you from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are taking part of our session today. We've got 5 really exciting speakers today talking from all parts of Australia, including 3 states and territories that I've lived in and know really well. So for me personally, it's fantastic. Everyone's going to have 10 minutes to present. We'll have a short Q&A after each presentation. And if we've got time at the end, we will open up to more general questions. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a little Q&A button with a couple of speech bubbles in it. If you could post any questions in there, then we're able to keep track of them and we can respond to them. We can also send them to the speakers if we're unable to find time to answer them today. We'll also be monitoring the chat, but the Q&A function really is the better one. There's also if we draw, people can also put up their hands, but really encourage you to use that Q&A function. So without further ado, you've already been waiting for this to start. I would like to introduce our first speaker, David Sykes, who is Principal Demographer at the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, which is a real mouthful to say. He's going to be talking about being all things to all people, which we are as demographers, and giving an overview of the demands of a state government projection team. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Kim. I will just ensure my screen is shared. I hope it is and everyone can see that okay. Yes, thank you, Kim. I'll also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you from in Melbourne, recognise any elders past, present and emerging, and any other Indigenous people who may be present today. I'm going to start with a really broad overview of what we do in a projections team and what are the sort of demands and challenges that we come across. There's 3 of us in our team and there's a lot more than 3 clients on the screen at the moment. This is just a scattering of some of the people we deal with from day to day, week to week, year to year, across state government and beyond. We call this our userverse. It's all of those people that we might interact with, sometimes a very quick interaction, sometimes an in-depth ongoing interaction. But when we capture all of those, we suddenly realise just how many different things we're doing for how many different people and the directions that we get pulled in at times. And you wonder why we sometimes don't get as much sleep as we'd like, but that's life. We can also think of that userverse, we can scatter it or we can think of it a bit more as where we are and then a couple of orbits around us. So first of all, we're thinking about our department, DELP as we call ourselves, Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Then there's other state government departments and then there's a range of agencies beyond us. And really in very, very broad terms, what those agencies, people are looking for is a projection of the future and what that's going to mean for demand for their services, impacts on something that they manage, look after, or revenue that they might generate. Because when it comes down to it, we're all in government. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for the people. We're all about the size, the distribution, the characteristics of the population and how that's changing over time. So if we can provide good, solid advice on that, we can help people do their jobs. Within our department, we have, there's our research area and we sit within planning. And if you go straight down the line for planning without stepping on WA's toes too much, because they're going to talk about planning in a little while, our population projections feed straight into the Victorian planning system, and they work from the top as our projections all the way down to the implementation of local policies through a range of strategies, planning provisions. But in the Planning and Environment Act, it says that all decisions must have regard to the official state government population projections. So we're there in the Act. They can't get rid of us, I hope. Taking a little step out in DELP to other things that we do in the planning area, population projections are really useful for land supply calculations. You know how much land is there, but if you want to know how long it's going to last, you need to know how many people, how many households are going to be in various places at various times. And when we get to strategic plans, we're thinking about that on a much broader scale. We're not just thinking for one town or one corridor. We're thinking, how is that going to be managed across the whole of the state and the city? And then we're thinking about what's the optimal distribution. And that's where we get to one of the issues I'll quickly highlight a bit later on. Sometimes we're talking about the trends, sometimes we're talking about the policies and the aspirations, and they don't always line up exactly. Another step out within our department, and we're into looking at environment and water. Within the environment area, we're looking at climate change. So this is really where we're talking about impacts. Impacts on the natural world, impacts on waterways, impacts on biodiversity and the wildlife that we have. How are people's habitats expanding into natural habitats and affecting natural habitats? If we don't know the quantum that we expect and when we expect that to happen, it's much more difficult to plan for. Moving out, right out into the next orbit, which is still very, very close to us really, the other key government departments. The top one that you see on the screen there is Treasury, and that's where we're doing projections for the state budget, and that's where we really start to hit on that revenue point. If we have strong growth coming in the future, then Treasury are happy that we've got more money coming in. Where we don't have so much net growth coming in the next couple of years due to COVID, that's when Treasury starts scratching their heads pretty hard. But all those other departments, again, are people servicing departments one way or the other. Justice need to know where they're going to be putting prisons, how they're going to be operating courts, and for some reason they're particularly interested in 18 to 29-year-old males. I really don't know why, but that seems to be their game. Transport are interested in the great big sweeping city-changing projects and how a suburban rail loop might impact and change population, and how then that might feed back and change all the other population impacts. And they need to know right down to, there's about 5,000 transport zones across the city, and they want populations for that. Education want to know about individual age groups for kinder or broad sweeps of the city for doing large-scale capital planning. Moving out another step, but still very much state government interactions, there's a whole other orbit of agencies and organisations that perform these state government functions, but they're that other step removed, so that they're different clients to deal with in different ways. The police, the fire services, ambulances, Melbourne Water, and then all the other water authorities that manage the water retailing and the waterways across the city. The Victorian Planning Authority is a key planning arm, but it's not actually a state government department, it's another agency, and they do a lot of precinct planning, looking at the growth areas around the city, but also about core redevelopment precincts. And then there's Infrastructure Victoria, who look at a big future view, sort of a 30-year future view, and make broad scale recommendations about where we might go, rather than state government, which tends to be a little bit less blue sky at times. And across all of these areas, we have, I think, the standard forecasting issues that everyone comes across when they're doing forecasting. Where we have trends and someone has a policy aspiration, how do we marry those two together? Some people will say their policy aspiration should be our projection. Others are more comfortable with the fact that a projection is about business as usual. And if you want to bend that trend into the future, then you can have an aspiration. There's a whole range of clashes really between the spatial scales and the time horizons that we want to do things. When people want to know about a very small area way out into the future, we really need to caution them about the uncertainty that comes about. And that leads into those user expectations. Beatrice, who's in my team, her first question in any meeting is always, how much difference matters? When you're talking about kinder classes, if you've got an extra 10, 15, 20 kids in an area, that means an extra class. When you're talking about building railway stations, 10, 15, 20 extra passengers probably doesn't make that much difference. we need to be concerned with the timeliness and the currency of our projections, making sure that people are aware that data has lags, that they can't find out an estimate for yesterday necessarily. They need to use a projection of today. And sometimes people struggle to get their head around that you need to do a forecast for today or tomorrow. So that all comes under resources. As I said, there's 3 of us. We can't do everything for everyone, but we try really, really hard. And one of the other things that we do try to do is to manage the sort of different levels of education and sophistication that we have amongst our users. Some are very experienced, power users, know exactly what they're doing. Some need to be walked through things and become power users very quickly once we let them know what all these issues are and how you deal with them. Just 2 really quick ones though. We try to get people to think spatially. As people who have that in our minds, sometimes we're amazed that some planners want to plan for places but don't necessarily get the idea of where their place sits in the world. So bringing them along for that journey can be fun. And we want to get people to consider uncertainty. This is my favourite picture at the moment, this one with the signs in multiple directions. This is my favourite COVID sign at the moment because we could be going anywhere. We're very confident of things from one week and we're not so confident the next week. But even in normal times, there's a whole lot of uncertainty around anything you say about yesterday, today, tomorrow, and just communicating that to users and trying to get them comfortable with the idea that we don't have a crystal ball. We can't tell you the exact future. But I went back to 1950 to find this quote, and I will read it out very quickly. It says, "In spite of all the obstacles, none of which can be underestimated, and all of which seem to announce the foolhardiness of any attempt, population projections must be made expertly enough so that the planner can perform their function, planning for the future of their area." Now, I've been called a lot of things. Foolhardy is usually one of them, so it's okay to say that. But yeah, it's a difficult job that we do. But that comes from the American Society of Planning Officials, but George Box put it a lot more simply, that all models are wrong and some are useful. We aim to be as useful as we can to as many people in that userverse as we can every day that we do our jobs. And if we can do that, Beatrice and Mitchell and I and our team, then we're very happy with what we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was a really succinct wrap up of the broad and extensive scope of jobs that state planner projection specialists do. Now we've got time for a couple of questions for David, if anyone's got any. I can't see any in the Q&A section. So maybe what I'll do, if there are no questions coming through, is that I will proceed on to the next speaker. And I encourage you, if you've got any questions that come up, to think of them for David, then to put them in the Q&A and we can address them at the end. So thank you very much, David. It's always good to be reminded that we're wrong, but hopefully useful. So now I am going to hand over the reins to Glen Heyen. He is the Principal Statistician in the Demography and Indigenous Statistics Division of Queensland Treasury. And he's going to be talking about new school planning processes in Queensland. So over to you, Glen.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Kim, is that up on the screen working?
Yes, it is. Yep, I can see it clearly.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So what I'll be walking you through are the new school planning processes that we undertake in Queensland. And it's very much a two-phase process, one that looks at the demand side of planning for new schools, and the second part of the process is looking at the supply and matching that up with the demand side of things. So this is a very broad level overview of those processes. So the first phase, as I was saying, is looking at the demand side. What I'd like to do with you is, rather than look at actual data, I'd like to take you through the partnerships that are involved in these processes, the process itself and the outputs, but certainly the partnerships, I really would like to focus on those. So in terms of the demand side, it's about population projections. So if we're talking the need, the planning for new schools, it's about population projections. So in terms of partnerships, while I'm from the Queensland Government Statisticians Office, QGSO, I'll keep that for short. So we partner with our local government councils, very, very important partnership, certainly with the planning areas within the major councils, and the key input from that partnership is planning data, usually at a very small level, which allows us to do that planning for the new schools. So the process itself is the population projections modelling that we do undertake, and the key output of that modelling is projected population age, of course, if we're looking at schools, and SA2, for those not familiar with that, that's an Australian Bureau of Statistics geography level, statistical area level 2. It's more or less a suburb type level, so if you're not familiar with that. Okay, so as I said, it's quite a broad overview, so I have included links so that if you are interested, you can click on the links in the presentation that will be provided, and you can search in more detail. But what I'm showing you here is from our website, it's the demand side. So these are the projected school age persons at an SA2 level in map and table format. So that's actually determines the supply side. Sorry, the demand side. And just drilling down a little bit further, this is what you can find there. And I'll just draw your attention in particular to the right-hand side. And I've highlighted an SA2 Caloundra West on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And the final 4 columns are the projected school age persons, looking at primary age and secondary age. And you'll notice also that it's for 2 decades, it's sort of the next decade from 2021 and then the second decade from 2031. But certainly some very large numbers. So we are projecting approximately 2,000 extra primary and 2,000 extra secondary children every decade. So significant demand at that level. So that's just as an example. And I just put in a couple of maps so that those familiar with the Sunshine Coast and Caloundra in particular can see it's on the western side, of course. And not sure how clear this is on your screens, but this is just showing that area is a greenfield area which has already started developing in a big way. Okay, so I'll move on to the second side of the new schools planning, which is looking at the supply side and of course matching that up against the demand side from the projections. So the second process is what we call school demand mapping. So we're basically mapping that demand with the supply. You can see in the list of partnerships a huge number of partners that work together. So it's a very thorough and large process. So the key point I'll make here is that in Queensland, the 3 school sectors, which is the state government, Catholic education and the Independent Schools Queensland sector, the 3 sectors work together on this demand mapping. You'll also see that we include even the local Catholic dioceses, the local government councils, ourselves as well, QGSO. There's also representatives from local non-government schools as well, and and quite a range of other Queensland government departments as well. And the key thing is this is run through what's called the Queensland Schools Planning Reference Committee, of which all those people are members. And the process itself is quite long-winded, of course, but it's cross-sectoral new school demand mapping, cross-sectoral because it does include the 3 schooling sectors. And the output of that process is a number of recommended new schools at the primary and secondary level. I've included this screen just to show you for reference purposes. You can get to the Schools Planning Reference Committee website and read more about it there. I'll just quickly go through this. So this slide sort of summarises the process of the new school demand mapping. So it obviously determines demand for future new schools. It entails meeting with councils in certainly the high population growth areas. So we actually hold individual meetings with councils. The assessment is done at that SA2 or sometimes at a slightly clustered up level. And as I said, the meetings include that broad range of representatives, stakeholders and so forth. I won't run through all of those again. But of course, bringing all those people together, not only can we talk about population projections, but the councils can talk about any more recent planning information that's come available since the projections were produced. And with the school representatives, they can talk about existing school capacities, so they can be accounted for in terms of, are new schools needed over and above the existing schools and the capacities at the time. The latest round was completed in June this year, so we actually worked our way through that even. I think we got it just sort of mainly done before COVID hit in a big way, and that was done with 13 councils. And so this is on the what we call QSpark, so that's the Queensland Schools Planning Reference Committee, the website that I've linked to about 2 slides before. This is what the outputs look like on the website. So interestingly, it details at that sort of SA2 or cluster type level what the committee determines as the number of new government and non-government schools critically that may be required. And you can see that there's a bit of a range in the numbers as well. So it's quite a broad level set of recommendations. And you can, on the right-hand side, I've just highlighted, that's the demand side that comes through from the projections that were in a previous slide as well. So that's what's produced. So that's actually the demand mapping outputs. And my final slide, just a really quick plug. QSpark, I won't say that again, but the committee just recently conducted a number of schools planning forums, and that's also available on the website as well. And so if you are interested in that sort of type planning issues for schools in Queensland, you can also go there, and all of those presentations, as you can see, are available as well. So just a very quick plug for that if you're interested in further information and issues around schools planning.
Thank you very much. Oops. Sorry, my alarm for your time has gone off.
Oh, that was perfect.
I've got, so perfect timing, 10 minutes exactly. And we've got one question in the chat from Simone Alexander asking, do you only recommend new schools, or are there any recommendations for expansion of existing schools? And what about school closures?
No, the school demand mapping, it is just looking at new schools. So certainly where schools need to be closed or expansions, that while that may be discussed in terms of determining where new schools might be needed. There's no recommendations made for expansions. So yeah, it's quite strictly just with new schools.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there any other questions before we move on? So I thank you, Glen. Getting schools right is one of the most difficult things because unfortunately future parents don't plan their children in a steady supply way. Okay, one quick question, Glen. What would the likely lag be for a situation like 2020 where we could potentially see population shift from city to regional areas? Oh, I've got some background noise.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You just cut out a little bit in my system. You're saying what's the lag?
What might the potential lag be from 2020 when we're seeing populations shift from city to regional areas?
In terms of coming through anything different through the mum, possibly. So that would need to be reflected in data, and then also data then in our projections, as we all know with modelling. I would suggest maybe 2 to 3 years. You know, by the time the entire process works its way through. So yes.
Excellent. Well, we've also got Angelique Parr, who's talking as part of the session for New South Wales about the impacts of COVID on population. And there should be a recording from the session yesterday on population impacts of COVID that might also give us some insights into this very issue, which we're all grappling with. So, Glen, if you could unshare your screen now, we will move on to the next speaker. So thank you very much. Now we're going from Queensland up to the Northern Territory. Rodney McComiskie, who is the Director, Economic Analysis in the Department of Treasury and Finance. He is going to be talking to us about the Northern Territory population projections and applications in health planning. Thank you, Rodney.
Thanks, Kim. Is that presentation up, that slide?
Yes, it is.
It is being shared. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Kim. Yeah, so I work in the economic analysis area at Northern Territory Treasury, which is responsible for preparing the population projections for the Northern Territory, the official projections. We're probably not we generate the projections, we're not a great user of the projections. So I guess in preparing this presentation and discussing health outcomes, of liaise with our health area, just to give you a heads up. So if there are any detailed questions, I might have to take them on notice. But I have with me as well the man who actually prepares our health projections, Mr. Hitesh Khanna. So he has, in the last 5 years, developed a new population projections model for the Northern Territory. So we had our first projections with the new model last year, 2019, using the most recent census data. So that was several years in the development after having many rotations of having band-aid solutions to our projections. So we think they're a lot more robust and actually represent what is happening in the Northern Territory economy. Now, I'm just going to start with a quick overview of the Northern Territory demography, because it is actually quite different to the rest of Australia. So the Northern Territory has a small population, so it's only 250,000 people spread out over, you know, a sixth of Australia's landmass. So there are a couple of quite large population nodes, Darwin being the largest, which probably represents around half of the jurisdiction's population, and the rest is regional and remote. So the next largest urban centre is Alice Springs, which is right in the heart of Australia and as far away from anything as you can be. So it's an interesting geography, but it's also a very interesting demography in terms of the Aboriginal population represents around 30% of the population in the Northern Territory, compared with about 3% nationally. And about 80% of that lives in rural and remote areas. So straight away through the demography and the geography, you have a lot of challenges, I guess, in policy development and in service delivery to quite distinct population groups. coming out of that, the Northern Territory, a function of that is that Northern Territory is the only jurisdiction that actually does Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal population projections. So reflecting that they are such a large proportion of the Northern Territory population, we make sure that we understand what is happening with respect to, I guess, the ageing and the location of the Aboriginal population as well. So just to, as an example of that, I've just got a couple of metrics at the bottom of the slide, just showing the difference. So the fertility rate in the Aboriginal population at present is significantly higher than in the non-Aboriginal population. Life expectancy in this period of our projection model, you can see it's for males is vastly different. So, you know, the Aboriginal male is living for, what's that, 17, 18 years less than the non-Aboriginal. And another significant element of the Aboriginal population is it's not that mobile, which has implications for population projections as well. So on an annual basis, we're looking, there's probably a loss of 1,200 Aboriginal people compared to almost 14,000 interstate migration or rotations, I should say, for the non-Aboriginal population. So this has some quite significant impacts for our population projections and the outcomes. So just putting here a population projections pyramid. So the orange line is 2016, so the most recent census, and the blue bars are our projections out to 2046. So there are some really significant things happening in that pyramid. So the rapid aging of the Aboriginal population. So you see from around age 50 to the 85 plus, there is a significantly larger proportion of the Aboriginal population that is aging. So that will have significant impacts for health planning. And leading back to Glen's comment previously, I guess the smaller proportion of the younger population in that Aboriginal cohort will have implications for education planning as well. The other interesting thing around the non-Aboriginal population is that we do get a bit of aging. So if you look at the pyramid, it's not until the 70 plus age group that you get to have some aging in the non-Aboriginal population. It's sort of doubling, but it's still not that significant as a proportion of the total population. But you'll see that in the younger age groups, there's really not that much variation, and that is related to that population churn represented on the previous slide, that there are a lot of in and outward movements to the territory on an annual basis. So on an annual basis, there's churn in our population of 17 to 18% compared to probably 4 to 6% in the national population. So there's some interesting characteristics that we need to capture in our projections model. So with respect to health planning though, so liaising with our Department of Health, they've recently been through a significant research exercise forecasting what the burden of disease is going to be out to 2028 to inform their planning in terms of policy and delivery of health services in urban and in regional and remote settings. So their main metric in terms of measuring what the demand for health services is going to be is the burden of disease measure. So the disability adjusted life year, or daily, is a common metric that's used to determine what the disease burden is in a community. So the daily measures the years of life lost. So that's the burden of fatal disease, so premature death, plus the years lived with disability, which is the burden of non-fatal disease. So what's the burden on an individual of living with a non-fatal disease? So dailies tend to be reported either as a rate or as in aggregate. So I have below, at the bottom of the slide, what the rate is. So this is a real rate based on data from 2004 to 2013. Which shows the burden of disease is probably about 3 times higher in the Aboriginal population than what it is in the non-Aboriginal population. So that's a really significant number in terms of health planning, in terms of where do you need to put resources to reduce that burden of disease in the community. And in terms of Aboriginal population, but also geographically based on the population projections, which we only do to the SA3 level in the Northern Territory. So Glenn was talking about having, you know, quite detailed projections at the SA2 level, but we find that even at the SA3 level, because in a lot of the SA3s, the population is so small, by the time you turn the data into rates to put into your projections model, there can be a high degree of variability, and there's a need for a lot of manipulation of the data to actually come up with what are considered to be reasonable population projections. So the Department of Health has also estimated what the number of dailies is. So this isn't a rate, so this is in aggregate in the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal population for a range of diseases. So this is a slide which shows the burden of disease for a cohort. So there are other diseases that they actually measure as well, but I've just focused on a few. An observation would be that even though the Aboriginal population is about 30% of the NT population, they carry a significant burden they carry the significant proportion of the disease burden in the Northern Territory. For all of the metrics, I think there's only one or two where the burden of disease is actually greater in the non-Aboriginal population. So the difference in the types of disease that impact the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal population is quite significant as well. So looking forward out to 2028, it's in the non-Indigenous or non-Aboriginal population, cancer is the major disease burden, and in the Aboriginal population, it's going to be cardiovascular disease. So just looking at cardiovascular disease, and across a broad range of diseases actually, it tends to be, the Aboriginal burden tends to be about 2/3 of the total burden of the disease, even though they represent 30% of the population. And a particularly stark one is in the kidney urinary area, which is the third last set of bars, where the Aboriginal population represents about 3/4 of the burden of disease in the total territory population. So that is really quite significant from a health perspective for individuals, but also populations, and in terms of where the health department chooses to put its resources and what those resources might be. So going back to, I guess, focusing on this cardiovascular, which is the major disease burden in that Aboriginal population, the research suggests that, you know, there's a high degree of comorbidity between cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and chronic kidney disease. So that means that they're often they occur at the same time in patients, and the evidence also suggests that there's, you know, a causal relationship between diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and also the chronic kidney disease, which suggests that, you know, controlling for, or having better control over these comorbidities could impact, could reduce the burden of disease in the Aboriginal population for that high risk area, which is the cardiovascular disease. And there's a lot of good reasons to actually do this in terms of patient outcomes, so better patient outcomes, but also trying to reduce the cost in delivering these services. So I come from a treasury, so we're located in treasury. We're always interested in reducing the cost of delivering effective health services. So where we can do that, we definitely encourage it. And there's been, you know, significant focus on delivery of health services in regional and remote areas, because there is a strong connection to country in the Northern Territory, in the Aboriginal population, a large portion of which is quite traditional. So better health comes through more localised delivery of health services, potentially contributing to more efficient delivery of those cost services as well. I've just got an example of, I guess, how that risk of cardiovascular disease and how treating the symptoms early can actually improve health outcomes is the delivery of public dialysis facilities in remote communities. So in remote communities, I guess there's a number of issues. So there's a high attachment to country. There's often a lack of trust in terms of travelling and going into clinical settings to receive treatment, which are all factors that contribute to poorer health outcomes in the Aboriginal community. But has been a concerted effort to focus on some of the comorbidities in the Aboriginal population to minimise the risk of disease progressing to more severe diseases such as the cardiovascular disease. So I've just got up on the screen where there are a number of public dialysis facilities in remote communities to support improved health outcomes and progression to more serious diseases. So these numbers look probably, the populations are quite small, and in another jurisdiction, you might be going, what's going on? But I guess there is a concerted effort to improve the health outcomes. So I will leave it there. I can see I'm getting wrapped up. So I will take any questions as they come, but I may have to take some on notice, but we will see. Anyway,
thank you very much, Rodney, and thank you for responding. We've got time for one question, if anybody has one coming through. It's very interesting application of population projections. Okay, nothing is in the Q&A box. Yes, but as with David, I encourage you, if you've got any questions that are arising from Rodney's presentation, to put a question in the Q&A and we can address it at the end of the session. So next we're going from the Northern Territory to Western Australia, who are coming to us from a morning, not an afternoon session, thanks to our multiple time zones across Australia. Damien Martin is going to be talking to us, supported by David Christmas from the Western Australian Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage in the Strategy Engagement Division. They're going to be talking to us about population statistics and infrastructure planning, and I will hand over to Western Australia now.
Hi, and thank you. Few technical glitches. I hope someone's got the presentation that they can just fire up for us there. There we go. Excellent. Okay, so rolling on. First slide, thank you. Yep, that's it. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. Any good presentation obviously wouldn't be complete with a little bit of the numbers from the demography side of things. I'm not a demographer per se. I look after the demography team within the department. Myself, I suppose you could call me a planner or a geographer. So I come up with I suppose a slightly different lens. We do our WA Tomorrow population forecasts. They're done on behalf or by the Western Australian Planning Commission. We do them in probably consultation or more than consultation, in partnership with Treasury. So we have a relationship where we work through the projections, and we take a lot of advice from Treasury in terms of the short-term drivers and the economic drivers and the things that really change the interstate or the overseas migration factors, because that's really about jobs and the economic determinants. And then we massage that, I suppose, with our long-term forecast through our demography teams. But as you can see there, our population's forecast to grow between 3.1 and 3.4 million people at 2031. We provide bands, so we deal with some of those themes that we've heard earlier about how you deal with uncertainty in the projection. So we produce these every 5 years, and of course it doesn't provide for or really contemplate pandemics and those sort of things. So we're looking forward to see how things pan out. I suppose internally within our borders, we've done some work on obviously what the forward projections mean in the current environment, but we're continuing to watch this space and watch all the work that's been done throughout the country on this important issue at the moment. So next slide, thanks. So just by way of, I suppose, a bit of local flavour, what we have here is our metropolitan context. What this is showing is our high growth areas, so more than 4%, and moderate growth between 2 and 4, and our stable to minimum. So really what you can see there is predominant growth still happening through our, I suppose, our expansion or our urban front, with some splatterings in our infill and inner area context. So predominantly, majority of population growth still remains, I suppose, on those urban fringes. Okay, so next slide, thanks. We do them at SA2 as well. So next slide. Sorry, we're a long way away. It'll probably take a bit to refresh.
Yep. I'm trying to move that.
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, it's all good.
James, are you able to?
Keep clicking.
Oh, I can see it.
Yeah.
No.
It's a long way to pedal. You've got to pedal pretty far to get from.
Right, we've lost the screen share. There we go. It's coming back.
Yep, no, that's all good. Slide 4, I think we can jump to.
Slide 4. As I said, it wouldn't be a Zoom seminar without a few technical glitches.
No, absolutely, absolutely. It's all the joys, isn't it?
It is.
It's amazing though. It's amazing how you know, business, government, everyone's pivoted in the COVID era to with the uptake of, you know, the technology and you know, the online meeting and all that sort of stuff. It's been quite remarkable, actually, the extent to which we're now doing this, and it's almost second nature. So.
Well, it is a joy to be able to talk to Western Australia so easily without having to fly for 4.5 hours. And here we are, slide 4.
Slide 4. All right. So in the regional areas, again, high growth this time. We've, I suppose, sliced the data at the 2%. Stable to moderate is 0 to 2, and then decline. What I suppose interesting in the West Australian context is, generally speaking, all of our regions are growing. But within those regions, there's the haves and the have-nots. So there are places that are still quietly growing, and there are places that are still subject to population decline. It is a big state, and you know, what we'll also find is when we do have economic drivers and major developments, we tend to see the population transfer from one region to another. So it doesn't always mean when you have a major development or a mine expansion, for example, in the regions, it doesn't mean that the people necessarily come from the city. Sometimes they come from the other regions. So it's an interesting dynamic. Next slide, thanks. This is where it gets interesting again. Keep pedaling on this.
Doesn't like changing the slides.
No, you see, no. There we go. Good slide. I'm pleased that someone else had a pyramid, so I'm not the only one. I won't go into this in too much detail, but you know, population's obviously growing in Western Australia, and I suppose the next slide will help me explain this a bit. So the demographers, I suppose, will be all eyes to the screen there, but the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. What we're seeing here is obviously we're getting older. So in the youth perspective, whilst it's growing, it still represents between 16 and 31, 1 in 5. But in that over 65 cohort, we're going from 1 in 8 to 1 in 6. And in the over 85, that's twice as many. So whilst we're a growing population, we will have all the service demands and all the needs for a lot more older people and you know, more youth. Whilst in percentage terms, it's not necessarily changing, it is changing in absolute terms. So I suppose if we can just change tack a little bit now and move on to slide 7. This one's a bit hairy, but from the broader perspective of my portfolio area, we try to combine the land use and the population projections together. And really it's all about the land supply, the land demand, and ultimately population growth gives rise to development and infrastructure staging. So for us, our forecasts and our population is about our strategic planning perspective, and then the delivery aspect, which is where we get to the infrastructure part, and our friends at Treasury wanting to know and understanding what and when we may need things. The slide on the right-hand panel there is, I suppose, a snapshot of all the things we do in our data analytics team. All of these things are inextricably interrelated, but all of those products that you see there help us to provide a picture both within the department but across government in terms of a whole range of things. We obviously do the population projections, but we also do dwelling forecasts, we do employment forecasts, not a bad picky, and a whole lot of other things as well, which for us it's all about providing, I suppose, the intelligence from the land and population perspective to government for informed decision making. Rolling on then to slide 8, if we wouldn't mind. So from the infrastructure coordination perspective, a lot of discussion over the preceding years about the shape and the structure of our cities. A lot of discussion about, connected cities, dispersed cities, and so on. We do have a strategic imperative of trying to consolidate the urban front and have a greater percentage of growth occurring in our infill areas. For us, that is a 47% infill rate. We're a little bit different the way we calculate it here in the west to some of the other states. We don't include our growth on the fringe within our targets, but all of these things give rise to us trying to understand the land use. We manage and plot the urban front. We look at that with our population projections, and ultimately we provide that through our spatial mapping tools, so our GIS platform, and we then share that to government for them to understand what the drivers are for development. And then we ask the agencies to then respond where they can with their infrastructure response. So what we try to do is, I suppose, join the POP with the housing, with the service delivery. So next slide, thanks. So I suppose this shows us pictorially how it sort of hangs together. We have at the state level the state planning strategy. We're currently going through, not us, not the department, but the state is doing a state infrastructure strategy. And of course, we've recently released the recovery plan as a result of COVID. From that, or from some of those, we also have documents that we've been previously done, which is Directions 2031, which is the helping to reshape that balance between the sprawl and consolidation and infill. We then have a whole lot of other lower order strategic documents dealing with Perth and Peel, which is our metropolitan area, and of course then our major regional centres also have strategic plans. They look at the population growth, they see what and where that's going to go at the small area, and then we try to, again, coordinate the infrastructure. In the regions, it's an interesting one, and it's the difference between, I suppose, the growth and the aspiration, and I think one of the previous speakers alluded to this, and that gap between the business as usual, I suppose you could say, and the aspirational growth, that's the policy imperative and the intervention that we either need to make through a policy lever or through economic development initiatives. So as you can see there, the sub-regional strategies sort of fall out from those. Next slide, please. So in summary, I suppose these are all the agencies and all the parts of the jigsaw puzzle that we do across government. We work very closely with education in terms of their primary school planning for primary schools and secondary schools. We do work with them, though. We do cut the data up for small area. We do provide them data by their primary school catchments. Although increasingly we're finding that we're trying to deal with it at a larger or sub-regional catchment issue. We do provide from time to time bespoke forecasts for the health section. We liaise very heavily with our friends in the social housing space. Again, fire and emergency services and police are users of our information and our analytics teams to help them understand what their future needs may be. And our utility providers are major users of not only the population forecasts, but the other intelligence that we gather on land and building. So again, for coordinating the infrastructure. So really, I suppose from the West Australian perspective, it's a collaborative endeavour with Treasury and across government to try and or ensure that we get great coordination where we can, and continue to strive to get it better. So on that note, thank you, and if there's any questions, happy to try to respond to them.
Thank you very much. What strikes me following that presentation and David's earlier is just how integral population data is across the business of government in all ways. I'm just looking at the chat. There's no questions that have come in yet. So again, if you've got any that you're thinking about, got a couple at the back of my mind for, but what we'll do is we'll get our final speaker, and then we can have a bit more of a conversation across all the panelists. So thank you very much. And now finally to my home state, New South Wales, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Angelique Parr, who is Principal Analyst in the Strategy and Reform Team in the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and she's going to be talking about something we're all thinking about, projecting uncertainty in uncertain times and the impact of COVID-19 on New South Wales population. Over to you, Angelique.
Great, thanks Kim, and thanks for the introduction. And I am just trying to share my screen.
All good.
Great. My presentation hopefully ties together everything that everybody else has spoken about, and actually what you've all been talking about has really been a good segue into what I thought is actually very topical right now. I'm in a similar boat to David, that my team, we do exactly the same thing as he does, but in New South Wales. So we're responsible for production of official population projections that are used across the state government, and I love his diagram of the userverse, probably identical if I was to draw the agencies that we deal with as well. So what I wanted to focus on today were population projections, which is my team's bread and butter, and is a very important demographic data item for government, because a key role of government is planning service delivery, is planning the infrastructure for the population in the future, and it's making sure that those services and things that people need and people use are in the right places at the right time. So moving forward, I mean, for me, the story about New South Wales population is all about growth. As you can see from this chart here, it varies from year to year, but our population, since we started collecting population stats, the state's been growing, and we certainly expect that to continue into the future. As we suggested here from our population projections that were last released in December 2019, so almost a year ago. And at that time, we were projecting that by 2041, our state's population would have increased to well over 10 million people. And you can see the relative dynamics of what's happening, that just over half of that growth would be due to migration, with net gains from overseas migration being actually offset by losses of people interstate. That's a very long-standing pattern in New South Wales. We're a net donor of people to other states and territories. And on the other side there, 1.3 million additional people through natural increase. But, you know, things change. Along came COVID. 11th of March, the WHO declared it as a global pandemic and everything went up in the air, and it's like, what the heck is going to happen? And that's been a question that we've been dealing with ever since. And I'm sure the other presenters here on the panel today are dealing with it to some extent or another. So in New South Wales, we've been putting a lot of effort into actually thinking about this. What does it mean for us? How does it affect what the government will be doing moving forward into the future? So looking at the population statistics, and it's only 6-7 months on since early March, but we're certainly seeing some impacts already evident in the official stats. And of course, the most obvious one was when we closed our international borders and overseas migration dropped through the floor. So at the moment, the number of people coming and going from Australia is virtually nothing, and it's certainly 99% less than what it was normally. This is totally expected. People cannot come to Australia unless you're a returning Australian, or you have to come for some extremely important purpose. So for example, if you're someone in the medical profession that's coming here, something related to COVID itself. So, you know, when did this last happen? You know, this is just an unprecedented event. And for all of us, we're struggling to cope with something that the vast majority of the population hasn't seen in their lifetime. Probably the number of folks that are still around that were alive in 1918 are probably fairly few. And even if there was a larger number of group, if it was more recent, the social context of this pandemic is very, very different, and the demographic context of the pandemic is very, very different to what it was just over 100 years ago. So in terms of trying to assess how this is going to impact on the population in the future, as a demographer, I go, well, how's it going to affect the drivers? We can certainly clearly see that overseas migration is virtually down to nothing at the moment. So that's half of the state's growth gone with the stroke of a pen when the federal government closed borders. But what do we think is going to happen with the other parts of the population change equation? So births, deaths, and internal migration. So this is where we're having to look for other sources of information, talk to other experts, and try and get some degree of informed outlook in a very uncertain time. None of us have a global pandemic to use as a point of reference. So we are very much in a state of crystal ball gazing to some extent. So looking at fertility, we've drawn on a piece of work. If you haven't seen it, it's worth reading, that Peter MacDonald recently did for the Commonwealth Centre for Population, looking at the future of fertility in Australia. Now, this chart taken from his report shows that fertility may drop considerably in the very short term before recovering again. But Peter's work was also suggesting that fertility is on the decline in Australia, but the pandemic, it's not the pandemic itself, but it's actually the fallout, and particularly any economic recession, which was announced last week by the New South Wales Treasury, that we are officially in an economic downturn for the first time. So where times are tough, people will consider delaying having children, and therefore we expect that there will be a short-term drop in fertility. To what level, we don't know. For how long, we don't know. This is Peter's best educated assessment of what is likely to happen. In terms of mortality, the number of deaths are extremely small, and the demographic assessment there is that there is unlikely to be any significant shift in mortality and therefore impacting on life expectancy. However, that I will be monitoring that closely, because what we don't know, of course, is what the longer term impacts are going to be on health of the pandemic, and particularly for people that have other underlying health conditions that may potentially be affected. That will only show up over time. Of course, the other part of the puzzle is what's going to happen with our interstate migration, and we certainly know from previous research that when there's economic uncertainty, it does reduce all forms of internal migration, and there's some great work being done at the moment with the Queensland Centre for Population Research in terms of how that may play out. So, trying to look at those changes and model how that may impact on the population. As several of our speakers have already said today, the environment is constantly changing in terms of how we see the impact may be. And you only need to look at two reports that came out from the federal government in the last 6 months, first being the mid-year fiscal outlook that came out in July, and the second being the federal budget that was released in October. And in fact, the population forecasts in those are quite different. And largely because of the assessment of overseas migration. And in the next 2 years, the Commonwealth is currently projecting that we will actually have a net loss of overseas migrants from Australia for the first time since 1946. And that is certainly not what any of the people that I've spoken to had previously thought would happen. So the goalposts are constantly changing. And this has implications for government across all agencies, but it is very important to recognise that those implications are not going to be the same. So, for example, if fertility drops, there will be a short-term shift, short-term change in the number of young children in New South Wales, and that will result in slower growth in the demand for more classrooms. And over time, it may affect demand for high schools and post-school education facilities. With an economic recession, we would expect that will have a greater impact on community services. People are out of jobs. Housing affordability is even more extreme, particularly in Sydney. So there would be a demand for housing support and back to work programs, for example. Working from home is going to change the demand for transport, and quite how that will play out will determine to what extent people continue to work from home or how they choose to return to the office. It also affects water, energy use and waste. We're not all working in the office, we're at home every day. And of course, thinking about how digital connectivity will work in a very different environment that we're all living in today than what we were in January and February, so not that long ago. So taking it back to the question that this webinar is about today, which is about the use of population data for government and planning. We have our key existing sources. They're largely from official population statistics, so census, all the suite of data that comes from the ABS, and places such as Department of Home Affairs for our overseas migration data, and also from Treasury, and various longitudinal population surveys that we have, such as HILDA. They are all at standard stock data sources that we all use on a daily basis. However, trying to get our head around what the impact of COVID is means that we have to look beyond those sources. And as somebody else pointed out earlier on in the webinar, these sources, official statistics, take some time to come out. There is certainly, can be a significant time lag. I mean, the census is only every 5 years. It will be very interesting, given it's next year, to see the results. So, in trying to make a better assessment of exactly how COVID is going to impact on our population dynamics, we need to look beyond those sources to other places. What administrative data sources can we use? The ABS has actually just released a new data set called Prime, which is has a quicker turnaround. It's a shorter production time, and therefore gives us some more insights. But it's actually looking at things like telco data and other location-based sources. What about administrative change of address information, or rental vacancy and housing activity data? What are those? Can those things give us some insight, like the canary in the coal mine, that can actually highlight that maybe there's a shift in some of the dynamics that we know and understand very well and have actually been in place for a long, long time. But in fact, maybe there is something happening out there that we can therefore use as some of our COVID modelling to think about how that may impact on the population, and therefore give government some insight in terms of what they may need to think about when they're moving forward, and reassessing the fiscal impacts of that, or how their service delivery or their infrastructure plans may need to be modified in some way. So thank you.
Thank you, Angelique. As always, see you visit. So, if there's any questions for Angelique, can you place them in, because we've only got a few minutes left in this whole session, and a question came in while Angelique was talking for the Western Australians. And it's a bit of a question about how people might use scenarios. So the Western Australian projections are done every 5 years with different scenarios to deal with uncertainty. And the question is, would more frequent projections deal with this in a better way? But my question is also related, is how do planners respond to the range of scenarios? So would frequency help, but also how do people respond to the differences?
Thanks. Great question. I suppose more frequent projections, sure, and we do those for budget purposes. I suppose if you're trying to hit a 2031 or a 2041 projection, like we saw some of the others, those changes that happen from year to year are probably not going to massively influence those numbers at those 31 and 41 timeframes. So whilst we can do individual projections on a year-to-year basis, I'm not sure it necessarily adjusts or changes where you think you might land in 15 or 20 or 30 years' time. So it's highly usable for our Treasury friends in dealing with the budget processes, but maybe not so useful in terms of the strategic planning or the scenario planning aspect. In terms of the question about in regard to that, look, we encourage people to use the C band, which is the middle band, so greatest likelihood of occurring, and we use that principally for our projections. But in saying that, the other bands do provide not only our planners but our service agencies to understand from their business perspective what their risk profiles or their risk appetites might be in terms of the phenomenon or the thing that they're looking at. So those other bands do provide an opportunity for people to say, well, we know, for example, an area might have some really good economic drivers going on, or some jobs growth, and we might say, well, maybe we shouldn't be running on a C band. Maybe we should be running on a population projection for that area within those SA2s or local government areas that are above the C or C band. So we do encourage the planners to use those, but as a default position, I suppose, or a default perspective, we do use the C band. But it's up to the individuals to understand their business and their context, and we're happy to have those conversations with with again with the planning arms or the other parts of agencies to understand if and when they should contemplate using those.
Oh, that sounds like a really great way to use projections. Thanks for that. We've now got a question to you, Angelique. Is PRIME the Provisional Regional Internal Migration Estimates? Because this is from Simone Alexander. She's not heard it in that context before. Could you just
Oh, okay. Yes, sorry, I shouldn't have assumed everybody knew what I was talking about. But yes, Simone, it's absolutely right. This is a new product that the ABS released, I think, on the 2nd of November. It was their very first release. So it is a preliminary view of the regional migration estimates, and it's look, it's another source of information that we can add to our toolkit, particularly at this point in time.
Excellent, thank you. It's good to get that clarity. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and ask a question to David, but the other speakers might have some views on it. I want to know how your userverse is responding to the uncertainty that COVID has put up and that Angelique has talked about so eloquently. How are they dealing with what to do next? David, that's for you. Quiet.
Sorry, I was muted. Put my camera back on. When I talked at the end about sort of education and sophistication of users, and this really has been a point where I think users have been incredibly sophisticated, which on one hand is good because that to some extent they can take steps by themselves in understanding risk. To some extent, it just means they ask more and more detailed questions of us. But I think the whole sort of concept of risk has benefited from the discussions that we've had in the media from day to day, where there's been a much more sophisticated discussion of the future and risk and options and all of that in everyone's lives of late. So I think that has really benefited everyone. We've got that framework that we're thinking within, where people come to these questions with an informed position to start with, and they're really thinking about options and certainly not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Yeah, look, well, it's good to hear because that's certainly my observation as well. So we have got 2 minutes until we have to close. Are there any final questions that anybody would like to throw to the panel? I would encourage everybody to, if they have got questions, to contact people. The session has been recorded as well, so we can share that information. I'm just keeping an eye on the Q&A. No further questions are coming through. So I would like to then close the session. I'd like to thank everyone for their patience at the start with our slightly delayed start because of technical difficulties. I would like to thank all of our speakers who prepared presentations. We've had David, Glen, Rodney, David, Damien and Angelique, who have given us really a view of all of Australia, which has been fantastic. And I would particularly like to thank Edith, James and Anna from the ANU who have been behind the scenes making sure that actually we do know how to share our screens and have set up practice sessions and organised the speakers and everybody. It's really fantastic. I think COVID has shown that population is critical and our understanding of it in the way that we plan going forward. So that is 3 o'clock. That is our official closing time. And on that note, I will say goodbye to everybody and thank you very much.